thank you all for being here. Just another note on the questions, we saved a healthy amount of time for Q&A at the end. They want to, for recording sessions, if you want to ask a burning question in the middle, please do, just raise your hand and I'll repeat the question, but save most of your questions to the end if you can. So, first off, good afternoon. Thank you all for being here. We definitely appreciate you making time. I want to start off by just sort of a couple contextual questions. And by show of hands, or you can hoot, or you can do something else as an affirmative. But the first question is, have you ever seriously attempted to measure your impact? Okay, a little bit less than half probably, but a good number. Second question is, have you ever heard of the terms logic model or theory of change? Slightly fewer, but still a decent amount. Okay, good. So we've got some baseline knowledge in here, but hopefully this will be new material to most of you. If you don't know who I am, my name is Che Green. I'm the founder and executive director of an organization called Funalytics. We were, until very recently, called the Humane Research Council, and we've been doing this work for about 15 years. And what we strive to do essentially is provide data and research to help advocates be as effective as possible in their work for animals. Now, if you're an astute advocate, that begs the question, what is effective? And so we spend a lot of time thinking about what is effectiveness in terms of different programs, etc. And then that raises another question, which is what is impact? And how do we define the impact that we're having, and how do we measure it? And so that is my goal for today, to hopefully help everyone in this room get a bit of an understanding of what impact is, maybe what it isn't, which is often what we're focused on, things other than impact. It's something that I think many of us think is obvious at first. What is impact, and are we having impact? It's whether or not it's a binary question, yes or no, but it's much more nuanced than that. And impact, we have to strive to really understand what impact is beyond most of the things that we measure right now. And so, as Milton Friedman said, it's not about your intentions. It's not even really about your activities or the outputs that result from those activities. It's about the results. It's about keeping our eye on the prize, which is the ultimate goal we're trying to change or create for animals. If you're going to remember or think about in depth one thing or one set of things from this conversation, this is what I'd like you to focus on. Is that understanding and measuring impact is incredibly important. My guess is that you get that already because you're in this room. But it's also incredibly hard to do accurately. And that's going to be a theme throughout my presentation. So don't let me be too daunting to you, because even though it's incredibly hard, I also think it's incredibly necessary. And that even if you can't get all the way to a complete understanding of what your impact is, you can still learn a lot from simply going through the process and identifying some of those near-term outcomes that can serve as surrogates, if you will, for your impact. And so don't be daunted, or at least too daunted by it, but do understand that it's a difficult process and one that you can't take on lightly. Our recommendation, and we get asked this all the time, our recommendation at Funalytics is to start small and be very focused. So you may have a small set of programs or a lot of programs. Pick one, it may not be your main program. Pick one and then pick a single objective or goal for that program or campaign and focus on trying to measure that. And then you can take what you've learned from that process and hopefully apply it to your other programs, your main programs, what have you, your organization overall. So again, start small, be focused with your impact measurement. It might help to define impact a little bit more closely. And this is sort of an amalgam of different definitions that I've put together over the years and tried to simplify it a little bit. So I would argue that impact is the long-term and aggregate effect of a program, service, or intervention on the target population. Now let's just look at those components real quick. I highlight long-term, not because short-term impacts can also be meaningful, but I would argue that everybody in this room is focused on long-term sustained change for animals. That is our metric for success, I would argue. And so we need to be thinking about impact in terms of the long-term. That makes it harder to measure. It makes it more difficult, but that's the kind of mindset that we need to have. It's not just a short-term, did you, for instance, you did a showing of Earthlings, let's say, right? You had 500 people attend, and you find out, a third of them decided to change their behavior. But how long had they changed that behavior for? If they went vegetarian for a week, that's a far different impact that you've had than that they went vegan for life. And so you just need to sort of categorize what that impact is. So that's why we look long-term. Aggregate refers to the fact, or acknowledges the fact, that your program may have many different components, and that your messaging may be layered over time. And so you need to look at what is the combined, or cumulative, or aggregate effect of all of those different components. And we'll talk a little bit about how to break up and identify those components here in a minute. And then just briefly, a last note on target population, we've been doing this work for a long time, and over a decade ago, pretty much everybody thought of their target population as the general public. And sure, 98% of people actually want to change in some way to be more compassionate toward animals. But you need to be thinking more niched, more nuanced in terms of your target selection. It's not only helpful in terms of your advocacy, it's also a lot easier to measure against a niche population than it is against the broader general public in most cases. Impact measurement starts with identifying the goal. And so the goal, I would argue, for most people in this room is to reduce suffering or to save lives, some sort of derivation of those concepts. And whether it's chickens in hatcheries, or it's hens, or it's cats in shelters, or it's rats and mice in animal testing laboratories, our goal is to either prevent some animals from being born into cruel conditions, or to reduce or rescue them from cruel conditions, or things like that. Change behavior that result in fewer animals, all of those kinds of things sort of make up our goal. They all feed into what is our long-term and ultimate goal of trying to reduce suffering for those animals. But the problem is, and I alluded to this earlier, is that reduction in suffering is incredibly hard to measure. Right? So we can't always connect what our activities are doing in terms of changing behavior, and then a further step is to see what behavior change we've created, what impact is that actually having on animals. Not easy to do. There's so many assumptions that are involved. You have to do research, which is certainly my bailiwick, but there's a lot of component pieces to that. And so often what we have to do is fall back to proxies for impact. That's what I refer to them as. First off, don't just rely on anecdotal evidence. Sometimes that may be all you have, is all you have at hand. But anecdotal evidence, for those who don't know, is simply personal stories or personal experiences. And those are rarely representative of your target population. So don't rely on those, especially don't rely on those when you make big decisions or any major program choices. You can rely on them perhaps for very small things, but not for big decisions. Attitude change. Many of us are really trying to change attitude almost as our end goal in many cases, trying to improve attitudes towards animals, trying to increase the sphere of compassion to improve animals in our target population. But that stops short of that overall goal of reducing suffering. And in fact, all of these, except for that last one, stop short of that goal. That's why they're proxies. But some of these are arguably getting very close to that goal. And sort of as you go down the list, I think they get closer and closer. So attitude change is important, and we often do want to measure that. It's a pretty loose proxy, though, for impact. A better one is behavior change, but we don't always have the ability to actually catalog behavior change for a given target audience. So we might look at intent to change instead. So again, let's say you did that screening of earthlings, or the ghosts in our machine, and the idea is that you want to survey people immediately after and get an idea of what their intent is in terms of their behaviors or attitudes. You can measure attitudes immediately, but their intent in terms of behavior that they might change down the road. That's a proxy for the actual impact that you're going to have, because we know that not everybody who says that they're going to intend to change their behavior will actually change it. And we don't even know what that drop-off is in most cases. And so it's removed from the ultimate impact you're trying to achieve, but it's still a very important thing to try to measure. Now, if you can go further than intent to change and actually look at behavior change, then you're doing even better. What that requires, though, in most cases, is having a baseline understanding of someone's behavior. So if it's a documentary screen, you need to get a baseline survey of their attitudes, awareness, knowledge, maybe their activism, certainly their dietary habits. And then later you have to follow up immediately to get the short-term effects, and then long-term to actually understand what the sustained behavior change is. So again, that's where it starts to get complicated. That's the closer and closer we're getting to the ultimate impact we're trying to have. There's a concept of outcomes versus impact, and I'm going to talk a lot about that here in just a moment with an example. But outcomes are really the shorter term or more intermediate steps to the ultimate impact you're trying to achieve. They go beyond just the direct results of the work you're doing and look at things like satisfaction, looking at things like short-term behavior change, all of that. Doesn't necessarily get to the suffering that's been reduced, but it starts to get you a lot closer to that. And so let's look at a mechanism that helps sort of delineate between these different components. This is what's called a logic model, and this is just one example. There are a ton of them out there. This is a fairly basic one. It often breaks things into 5 different components, and this is for evaluating a program or planning a program. And we'll just walk through each one of these briefly. So the first one is inputs. It's pretty straightforward. That's the funding you have for a program. That's the staff and volunteer time you have for a program. It's the equipment, you have materials, things of that sort. Number two is the activities in which you engage. So that might be, for instance, leaflet, or it might be any of the number of activities that for people in here you do for animals. The outputs are the direct results from those activities. So if your activity is leafleting, the outputs are the number of people you've leafleted. Outcomes then take that further. Actually, let me back up. So that's where most people stop, is the outputs. And that's why we're having this conversation. Because a lot of people use their outputs as a proxy for the impact that they're having. So we leafleted X number of people. We did X number of spay-neuter surgeries. We handed out, our PSA reached X number of people. Those are not a measure of your impact. Those are a measure of your outputs. And that's the delineation that I think is probably most important in this conversation today and for you to take away, is that you need to be focusing more on that right-hand side, those outcomes and the impact, to get a better understanding of what it is you're doing for animals. We don't have time to really go into it in depth, but also down below you see context, conditions, and external factors. Even if you went through and did a completely robust impact evaluation, there's always going to be external factors that may complicate things. Those external factors may influence the program as a whole, or it may influence any one of those constituent pieces. But it's important to acknowledge that there are things that are beyond our control, that are environmental influences that also play into our ability to be effective in our programs. So for a quick example, I'm simplifying the model even further and grouping it into 3 different steps. First, still inputs, and then activities and outputs fairly logically go together since they're directly related. And then outcomes, again, are sort of the short-term or intermediate steps toward your impact, so those sort of make sense to go together as well. We still need to think about context and conditions. So this is the mechanism I want to use to think about just a quick example that hopefully underscore or highlight how you might use a model like this to evaluate something. It also will underscore some of the challenges. So what are the inputs that went into the talk today? Using this workshop as an example, and for instance, if I were to try to measure my impact vis-a-vis this workshop. The inputs are pretty straightforward. The time that I spent to develop the slides, hopefully the knowledge and slight expertise that I bring to bear on the subject, the money to pay for airfare and hotel, simple stuff like that, and then the equipment. If we're using a laptop, using a screen, you're sitting on chairs, all that. Pretty straightforward stuff. It's slightly more complicated when we get into activities and outputs. Identifying the activity itself, easy, right? It's the workshop right now. And then outputs, that's where it starts to get a little bit harder in that, okay, reach. Well, what is the reach? The reach, arguably, I could just count the number of people in this room, and that could be the reach. But maybe that's undercounting. If you're going off and talking to somebody else and sharing the information, maybe we're getting people listening to the session afterwards. So trying to evaluate reach is slightly more complicated than simply describing the inputs of the activities. One step further would be something like satisfaction, which I would not be able to do myself on my own. I would need your input. Let's call satisfaction the interest you have in the topic, or the amount that you feel like you've learned about the topic. Now, if I wanted to measure that, I'd need to ask you. Now, if I wanted to measure that in a really robust fashion, again, I would do that before and after survey to get a baseline of your level of knowledge and awareness of the topic, compare that with the post-evaluation, and that would be my truest sense of impact on your knowledge of the topic. Not as easy to do. Again, I asked you those 2 questions at the beginning to try to give you a sense of what that would be like. That's a very neat way to do it. Of course, a survey would be much better. And then we get into the third area, which is hopefully where the magic happens. Now, what we would like to do, my goal ultimately is to save more animals with this talk, to reduce suffering by the impact that I have on your activism. I have no chance of measuring that, because what would have to happen in order to do that is I'd have to go through each of these steps. So first off, I'd have to figure out the learning. We just talked about that. It ties to satisfaction. I could do before and after surveys with you guys and figure out how much you learned and get a pretty good idea of that. Application becomes a different story. So if you're going to apply that knowledge, it may be a month from now, it may be 3 years from now, I don't know, and it could be in any one of a number of different ways. So I'd have to have the ability to follow up with you later and figure out how you've actually applied the information. Beyond that, I would have to figure out how the application of that knowledge has influenced your work. To what extent has it improved your programs? Has it made you more effective? That in itself is an incredibly difficult question to answer. And then we'd have to translate that into animals saved or suffering reduced. So it gets very complicated very quickly, which is why I encourage everyone to look at those proxies and to take sort of a step back from that ultimate goal of impact. If you have the resources to do it, great, but most of us don't. And so you have to take a step back and start to look at some of those proxies, what we call outcomes, which are the near-term, hopefully, steps that lead toward the ultimate impact that we want to have. So, again, not to be daunting, please do start with this process. Start somewhere, start small, be focused, and start to apply a truer understanding of impact to your work for animals. Now, if you want to take it to the next level, if logic models feel a little bit too simplistic for you, you can. Logic models are very descriptive and explanatory, whereas something like a theory of change is considered more predictive. And the theories of change are a little bit more complicated to undertake, but they're also more valuable because of it. And so the idea, there's a few distinctive points about theories of change. I'll cover them briefly. They always start with the end goal. Now, with the logic model, you can work forward or backwards, going from your resources to identify what impact you can have, or you can start from your impact and work back and see what resources you need to create that impact. A theory of change always starts with the impact first, and then you work backwards to try to figure out what causal steps can actually lead to the impact that you're trying to change. It's what's called a causal model. And that's where it gets more complicated, because at each one of those steps, to validate what you think you have to do in order to create the change you want, you have to do research, you have to validate all of these assumptions, and it becomes much more intensive effort. Again, it's incredibly useful if you can go through the process, but it's not an easy one to do. Logic models and theories of change are just two examples. Whatever tool or model that you use, the ultimate goal is to try to take a more strategic approach to our advocacy for animals, to really focus on what's effective and what impact we're having. As I start to wrap up, just a few quick points for you. If you have any hope at all of measuring your impact, you need to start with clear and measurable goals. Now again, reduced suffering may not be measurable, so identify those interim steps that will get you to reduced suffering that you can actually measure and focus on those. And then you can move on to something like a logic model or a theory of change to delineate between the different components of your program and hopefully figure out how they can interact and feed into one another. And then use research to validate your assumptions, especially in that theory of change model. You're going to need to use research to show the causality of the different components. Not quite as necessary with the logic model, which is why it might be a good starting place for people who are new to impact measurement. Don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good is something I like to say. So again, don't be daunted by it. Don't think that you have to have a perfectly accurate assessment of your impact in order to just start the process. Simply going through the process will be incredibly helpful for your organization and for your program, I guarantee it. And as a wise man once said, not everything that counts can necessarily be counted. Lastly, use help. Use the experts, if that's what we could be called in this field, myself and Allison. And then on logic models, the W.K. Kellogg Foundation is known as being one of the leaders in that field. They have a lot of different evaluation tools that are available for free. The Aspen Institute is one of the leaders in theories of change. Faunanalytics.org if you'd like to know what other research is being conducted around animal issues. We also provide direct services for animal groups to help them measure their work. And then I'm always happy to provide advice to anyone who wants it. So that's it. Thank you all for your time.
Slightly different than what Shay's been talking about. I'm going to talk about research that other people have already done, or research that you might do in going out and looking for resources based on the question you have in mind. So I hope that some of you in this room are thinking, but what I really want to do is test the impact of my personal program. But I think of that as sort of the advanced stage. And before you want to do that, you want to look at what's already out there and what kinds of questions have been asked and what kinds of questions can be useful to you. So even if that's your ultimate goal, I think that this talk should help provide you some resources to get started on moving toward achieving that goal. So the first question is why research? And Chay's already given us a really good answer to that. You might do some research because you're curious, but more likely you're doing research to inform your decisions and improve your effectiveness as an advocate for animals. Research can help you organize information that might not be organized in your mind when you start. It can help provide access to types of information that you might not have access to otherwise. For instance, if you have a program where you work with people and you don't follow up with them normally, you might be able to find research that has followed up with people who've gone through a similar program and know what people are experiencing 6 months or a year after they leave your classroom or after they leave your sanctuary. So I'm going to talk about some abstract things. So I want to talk about them in as concrete a way as I possibly can, which means I'm going to use one example throughout this talk. The example is going to be of a single decision. Imagine that I am preparing to give humane education presentations in high school classrooms about factory farming. Now, there would be a lot of decisions I'd have to make in preparing that presentation, but one big one is what kinds of videos to use or whether to use videos at all. I could ask how long to show videos for as opposed to talking myself. I could ask what particular videos to show, or even more basic questions like what kind of content should those videos have? What should the tone be? Should they be the grim videos of factory farm suffering or the happy videos of chickens in sanctuaries? There's a ton of questions I might have, and I might not know the answers as I start. So I would go out and I would try to do research. And I might start in any of a number of ways. I might start by talking to people in my personal network. That's fun, and it's part of why we're all here today. We are all here at this conference because we all have questions, and we all hope that other animal advocates can help us with the answers. So talking to people and learning from other people is a great way to do research. Another way, of course, is to use the computer. So I can type my question into Google, and Google will give me thousands of results, and some of them, but not all of them, will be meaningful in addressing my question. Of course, there will be so many every time you type a question into Google. There's so many results, you can't possibly get through all of them, and that can be really confusing. So one other place to go on your computer while you're doing research is to the Faunalytics website run by Chay and his team. They have a carefully curated database of articles and resources and studies that specifically deal with questions that animal advocates might want the answers to. So you can get back many fewer results, which you can look at all of, and many more of them, percentage-wise, will be to do with your actual question and will have relevance. So those are 3 places we might start looking. Once we're there, we'll find a huge variety of resources. So I'm going to talk you through several kinds. Of course, these are not the only kinds. Each of these kinds could be further divided. But my point here is that all of them have pros and cons, and I'm not going to tell you to only use this one or only use that one. But I want you to know about what I think the pros and cons are so that you can make an informed decision in weighing what evidence you find as you go about your own research. So let's start with anecdotes, the personal stories. They're really easy to find. It's really easy to find someone who has had an experience that is somehow relevant to your question. So to my question, I might find someone who has had experience talking to high schoolers or showing videos to high schoolers. I might find someone who has seen one of the videos I'm considering using or showed it to a friend or family member and can tell me the story of how that went. Or I might even find online people talking about videos they've seen. So that's the first positive of anecdotes. They're really accessible. No matter what your question is, you are always able to find someone with an anecdote. And the second positive is that we as humans have brains that really understand stories. And so whenever we see a story, when someone tells us a story, it's easy for us to absorb that information, and it's fairly easy for us to decide whether that story sounds plausible and trustworthy. Now, let's get to the cons. As Chay said, anecdotes aren't always representative. So as we get that story information and it feels so juicy to us, we might not realize that we can't take that as the last word. But maybe we could. Maybe we'll realize, because maybe we'll ask lots of people and we'll hear lots of anecdotes, and we'll realize they contradict each other, so some of them must be biased. But we don't know which ones to take as representative, because we can't really add up in our head how many times we heard this story versus that story. That's not what our brains are good at. Anecdotes can quickly become confusing if you have a lot of them. And if you don't have a lot, you don't know that they're representative, because you know you could have a lot and they'd all be different. They can also be biased as a group. For example, if I ask people here today what farm animal video they've seen that was most powerful for them, the answers I get will be biased towards the videos that have been recently released and the videos that a lot of people have seen, because that'll just be the ones that people are thinking about. There might be a video that would be just as powerful when I have the chance to show whatever I want to high schoolers, or more powerful, that people haven't seen or saw a long time ago and aren't thinking about. So there's a lot of downsides to anecdotes, and we might go looking for other resources. Something I want to pull out is a little bit separate from anecdotes is expert opinion. I could talk to an expert here at this conference. There's lots of people who've given humane education presentations here. Or on the internet, I could look for people who've given humane education presentations and written about them. Or, for instance, here's Katie Cantrell of the Factory Farming Awareness Coalition giving her presentation on a YouTube video that I can watch, and I can see what video clips she uses and think about why she chose what she chose. Now, the positives of expert opinions are, firstly, just like anecdotes, they often come to us in sort of a story format, which is easy for us to understand and digest. And secondly, that experts are experts for a reason. Their judgments are incorporating many, many sources because they have a lot of experience in the field. They might be incorporating sources like surveys and other research that I could go out and find, and they might just be incorporating a huge number of anecdotes from every time they've gone into a classroom and given a presentation and seen someone respond. But in any case, these are really information-heavy, rich sources of opinion. They're much better than my friend who just showed a video once to her mom. The negatives are that it can be hard to evaluate which experts are more reliable than other experts. As you start hearing many opinions, if they're contradictory, it can be difficult for the non-expert to figure out who to listen to. And secondly, experts might not remember everything that went into forming their opinion. If they saw a survey once a long time ago that showed that a particular video was really powerful, and now they use that video and also have a lot of anecdotes about how powerful it was, they may or may not remember to say, oh yeah, and I saw this survey which reinforces my point about this video. Which means that when you go out and see that survey, you might think it's totally unconnected to what the expert was saying, and that you have two pieces of information, when really those two pieces of information are tightly connected. So the fact that experts don't know exactly why they think everything they think, just like the rest of us, means that their opinions have some obscurities and some parts that you might not understand quite as well as you think you do. So you might look for more objective information. And the first place you might want to go there is looking at surveys. So these are great because they do aggregate information. Just the way that we can't tell which anecdotes are representative, a survey is going to show you which answers are most representative. So here, someone surveyed a lot of vegans and asked them why they became vegan, and we can see that actually seeing a video is a really representative answer. A lot of people said that. And they provided comments, and we could scroll through the comments and count all the times we see specific videos mentioned in them. So this is answering a big void that we had from anecdotes, where we didn't know what was prevalent. Surveys can show us what's prevalent in a population. Secondly, as far as things that are giving us kind of numerical, objective data, surveys are relatively easy to understand. We're really familiar with seeing them. We know that people were asked questions and they gave responses, and that was the basic procedure. So those are pros. Now to the cons. Beyond that basic picture of what a survey is, it can be hard to tell what are the benefits and drawbacks of a particular survey. So for example, in my situation, this survey has a drawback, which is that people who answered this survey were vegans in internet communities of vegans and animal advocates. And the people I'm talking to in classrooms are random high schoolers. Those two groups are not the same. So the answers that the vegans gave might not be the same as the answers that the high schoolers would give after we showed them the same inputs. That kind of thing can be difficult to notice when you see a survey that asks a question that's really close to the question you want to ask. It's tempting to just take it as the answer, but it might be the answer for a different group of people than the one you were really talking about. It can also be really hard to find a survey that's in the right context because surveys are expensive and difficult to conduct and can be especially difficult to conduct in particular contexts. So, for example, when I went to look for answers to my question I had for this talk, I could not find a survey of high school students that talked to me about what kinds of videos they found powerful to see in humane education lectures. The best I could do with this survey of vegans. So you might not find anything that bears really directly on your question. And thirdly, unlike with anecdotes or with expert opinions where you're consulting a specific person, you cannot go back in and ask new questions with a survey. This survey was a big undertaking. If you now want to ask more questions about the videos these people saw, you can't go out and recontact every one of the 1,000 people who answered this question. You're just stuck with the amount of data that you have there, whereas you could continue to talk to the expert or continue to talk to the friend telling you an anecdote. So you might go looking for more information. Sticking with the objective sources, you might look at experimental research. So research that's been done in labs or other carefully controlled settings. In this case, the experimenters found some young people. They chose randomly which video to show which person. And they watched the amount of time the person spent on the video, what sections they rewatched, and at the end they asked them questions. So this is data that would be really hard to get in a survey situation. People aren't going to remember at what moment they stopped watching the video. So this is really cool. And another thing that's really cool, this is the huge pro of experimental research, is that they were able to test a specific aspect of the situation, removing other sources of input. So as I hear anecdotes, the people who saw farm to fridge and the people who chose to see A Life Connected might just be different types of people who hang in different crowds or like to see different things. Whereas in this experiment, no one had a choice. So we can assume that they were pretty similar people, and any differences in their responses are really about the video. That's great. This is almost the only place where we can really see what causality is as opposed to correlation, as opposed to things that just happen together a lot, and we don't know which one of them is driving the other. Finally, like surveys, experimental situations often use data from many participants, added up, tell you what experiences were representative. So that's filling again the void in the personal story background of your experience. The negatives are that just like surveys, these are really expensive and difficult to conduct. So, firstly, it's hard to find them, and you might not find them in the right context or measuring the thing you wanted to have measured. Secondly, because they're hard to conduct, they're also hard to understand all the aspects that go into them. If they have flaws, you might not have initially noticed the flaws. If you see them reported on elsewhere, the reporting might be hard to understand. And if it's easy to understand, you have to worry about whether the reporter understood the original question research correctly or not. So that is a challenge. However, the data that they produce is so valuable because they are able to tease out causality from correlation so much better than other methods. Finally, I want to talk a little bit about case studies, which I'm going to mean by this any place that you see an expert writing a lot of detail about a specific situation that's relevant. So in this case study is the impact report that was written about the ghosts in our machine. They went through and they wrote about every stage from the production to the released, the release on the internet, to surveying people who saw the movie on the internet. And so you can see a lot of information that experts felt was relevant about the release of this particular movie. You might also find case studies where somebody's talking about a specific high school classroom's response to humane education in the days and weeks following the lecture. A case study can be on anything, but the big pro is that it's written by an expert in a lot of detail, so you can help learn about how experts organize their thinking about the topic. And it can often be very interesting, especially if it's presented in a story format. The negatives are that, primarily, it might not apply directly to your context. So, for example, this case study here, they didn't really show this video in parts of humane education presentations in high school classrooms, so I would have to think really hard about what they're saying in the impact report that does or does not apply to my setting. I have to do a lot of work. Additionally, because they're often about such a specific topic, they might be written by someone who's very biased or who wants to show that this particular video had a huge impact or didn't have a huge impact, or this was a great thing to do in their classroom. So you do have to be mindful of that kind of influence on what's being said. So now that everything has a pro and con, what's the solution? The solution is to use as much data as you can find and as many different kinds of sources as you can find. Don't just stick to one thing or one person. And once you're doing that, you want to weight some things heavily and others less heavily. So things that I think you should weight really heavily are expert opinion. Those are opinions of people who are really learned in a topic and their experience, and also any research they've done is important. Sources that apply directly to your context, and really good surveys and experiments. So again, good surveys and experiments have been well conducted, are aggregating a lot of data and showing you which is representative. You want to weight anecdotes less heavily because each one is only telling you about one circumstance, and it might not be representative. You also want to weight sources that apply to a different context less heavily. So for example, if I have a source that tells me that a particular video was really powerful when people saw it one at a time on like a pay-per-view booth, that might be great. But what if it's like powerful at the pay-per-view booth, but a lot of people leave halfway through because it's disgusting and upsetting? So the people who leave at the pay-per-view booth might be the people who are really moved to change. That person might be a person who's like, oh, this is so bad, I can't believe I'm part of this system, I need to change. So that's hugely effective in the pay-per-view setting. But in the humane education setting, that might be a drawback. If only one person in my classroom is going to leave for that reason, that could distract the whole rest of the classroom. And they might stop watching the video and start watching their classmate run for the door. So having a study that was directly in a context that's similar to mine would be much more helpful. That was a fictional study, by the way. There's not dumping on any particular study. Finally, you also want to weight less heavily sources that have specific problems. And this can be really hard to figure out what they are, especially with sources like surveys and experiments, where a lot of the problems that could be there are in statistics. But some problems are noticeable. For instance, if you notice that the source is written by someone who's biased or seems to have a lot of motivation to get you to believe a particular thing, that's a source you want to care about less heavily. Or if you notice that the source is measuring outcomes that seem wrong to you and not very connected to the ultimate impact, for instance, measuring the time people spend watching the video and ignoring the questions that they might ask later about intent to change, that can also be a reason to pass on that. But I encourage you, because this is very difficult, to go to people who can help you understand if there are any specific problems. Find volunteers, find academics, find organizations like animal charity evaluators, Faunalytics, that can help you look at a study or a survey and say, yeah, this is really reliable, or, well, this is fairly reliable, but it doesn't apply directly to your context in these three ways, if you're having trouble judging it for yourself. I know these aren't the only things that you'll be thinking about when you do research, but I hope it's given you